Hello, Doc from Barcast Audio here, and I'm joined today by Seth, a 2022 graduate of UPenn Law School. Thanks so much for joining me today, Seth. So Seth and I are going to talk about the bar exam essays. We are going to talk about, Seth is taking the upcoming July 2022 UBE, Uniform Bar Exam, and we're going to talk today about how he can build some strategies early on in his bar prep process that will allow him to become a better bar exam essay taker and maximize his points on the exam. So, Seth, we talked a little bit before we came on here, but I first kind of want to run through this in steps. I like to think that the focus of a lot of my one-on-ones on essays is really on developing strong habits, strong abilities in terms of responding to whatever the subject may be, right? Because as I told you beforehand, the law comes as you go through your bar exam course, as you go through this process. You slowly start to realize these things are clicking in my head. But what you can do early on is set yourself up for later success by developing good habits in how you're attacking these timed essays. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about the MEE. Those are the 30 to 40 minute, typically 30-minute essays. They're almost half of the bar exam. Them and the MPT make up the essay portion of the exam. And the first thing that I always tell students, especially early on, is read through MEE questions. You should be reading through at least 2 or 3 every day. It doesn't have to be like, oh my God, this is a 3-hour session where I'm just reading it. But set out an hour, set out maybe a little bit more at the end of your day, or at some point where you're not necessarily zoning out. So maybe a time after lunch or before lunch when you're really still locked in and you can make the most of that sort of active brain time. Because let's face it, a lot of times when we're studying all day, if we see lunch on the horizon, if we see the end of the day there, it's hard to really focus our mind on that. But I think it's important, especially at this stage, to at least for a few days read through some of these MEE answers or questions and just look at what's being asked there. Look at what subtopics are being touched upon within the fact pattern. I don't want you to do anything else when you're first reading through these. Just look through a bunch and just say, hey, this is a UCC question, a contract law question. This is asking about formation here. This is asking about defenses to formation in this paragraph. And I think this other issue is being touched upon in this paragraph. And as you're going through these, before you're really writing anything down, I want you to sort of underline facts and issues that you think are being raised there. The facts are going to be really important because that's something that really is going to allow you to score well when you start putting these pen to paper. But especially early on, we're a little bit deeper in this process and I typically start this, but I love the idea of going through there, looking at what the issues are being tested, and not just the issues. Underline what facts are giving rise to that issue. Because when you do put your answers together, what's really going to get you your points is connecting the rule that issue sort of imputes and the facts that are giving rise to that issue. So we're gonna talk about those connective words a little bit later on, but for now, it's just important to visualize that and see on pen to paper, okay, because you need to become more comfortable as you're going through these, you're just putting that together in your head before you even put anything down. Next up, and this is sort of a strange one because it feels like a waste of time sometimes. I want my students always to write out real copy model answers. And a lot of times Barbary and your bar exam courses will provide you with model answers that are like essays. They are like Moby Dick. And frankly, they're a little bit unnecessary. What I recommend in that regard is look at those. You don't necessarily have to write those down word for word, but look on state bar websites. When they have a lot of times, certain states, I know the Minnesota does it very often, New York State does it from time to time. They have model answers to every year's bar exam. And you can go through that year's bar exam, see model answers, and you can look and say, okay, this was the model answer here. And in all likelihood, the model answers from those states, they're not going to be the perfect answer. They're going to have their own deficiencies. You're going to see here that there are no perfect answers on the bar exam. And the problem with the Barbary model answers very often is that they are from people who have the time to sort of go through this and say, this is every issue that could possibly be tested here. But I think a better barometer for you as a student is to look and see, okay, this is the model answer, and this guy sort of screwed up the rule on this one issue. He wasn't necessarily perfect, but what he did was he connected this screwed up part of his rule with the relevant fact that was being tested here. So as you sort of write through some of these answers, it's sort of a twofold exercise, because you're seeing both how the best and most successful answers are organized, but you're also memorizing. You're helping commit those facts and those rule statements to memory. And let's say you see a rule and you see, oh, that's not really what I remember the rule being. I need to go look back and check that. That in and of itself is good, because it's allowing you to challenge what that person's rule is. It's sort of making you think a little bit harder about the elements of these rules. And a lot of times what you'll see in these model answers is the enumerated parts of a rule. And when we get those in our CMRs or whatever version of the rule we're looking at, too often I see these paragraph style rules where it's very like meaty. These rule paragraphs are very meaty. And what I like to remind people is the people who are grading your bar exam essays, they're law professors, they're smart people, right? But you have to think of them as little infant baby children who are not bar exam masters. They are people who you need to make this stuff as simple as possible for. And the reason for that is because you want to make it as simple as possible for them to look at your answer and give you points. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to say, okay, these are the 7 intentional torts. This is the rule for intentional infliction of emotional distress, and these are the 4 elements. He nailed all 4, and he enumerated them. He highlighted and keyed them right there for me. And honestly, this practice of really enumerating the elements of a rule within your answers will pay dividends in every element of the essay section of the bar. Because we'll talk about the MPT a little bit later, but that's another thing that really is super helpful to just clearly establishing what we're comparing our facts to. So once you've sort of started writing out some of these model answers, writing out these answers verbatim, I want you to move on to outlining some of these essays. And you can do more outlines. You can spend, let's say, 10 to 12 to 15 minutes really just outlining essays. So look at an essay, go through it, say, these are the issues being tested, these are the relevant facts. You can use that underlining tactic that we talked about before, and write up a short little outline of the issues, the relevant facts, and how you think they would connect, right? And the reason for that is because, honestly, the ability to look at a fact pattern, identify the rules being tested, identify the facts that give rise to those rules, and connect those two, that's all we're doing here. The actual getting pen to paper and the time commitment feels like a bigger challenge, but if we get really proficient at connecting those facts and outlining sort of quickly in real time, that is really what allows us to develop strong skills as the rules and the law become more second nature to us as we go through this process. So let's say you're outlining through an essay and you don't recognize the rules, right? You see some facts that you think may give rise to something. You can look at the model answer, you can see that rule, write that rule down really quickly, and it feels like a loss, right? Because you don't know exactly what you're supposed to know. But it's not a loss. You have to view all of these blank versions as wins early on, because you're building up to something. It's I always say it's sort of like a snowball, right? And bar prep is a snowball in many capacities, but one of the ways it is that the knowledge you have in the beginning, it sort of snowballs, and by the end of June, you start to realize I'm memorizing a lot more of this stuff than I thought. It's really becoming second nature to me, and that's when some of this stuff really is going to begin to click. Once we get into the first few weeks of July, you're going to see that as you're trying to outline these essays or do them cold, that the rules are going to come more naturally, and even if you're not necessarily nailing every element, you're going to feel like you have a better understanding. So just from that first section, do you have any questions for me?
Do the model answers, they have the questions too, and will I end up burning through the testing material that Barbary gives me if I go through all of the model answers online?
No. So a lot of times the public essay questions you can find online, they'll be separate and apart from the testing materials that the Barbary or your testing service may give you. the testing service may license particular questions. Generally, you may see some familiar questions, but honestly, that's not a bad thing. If you go back and you do a full cold essay later on Barbary and you say, hey, I remember this, I remember the facts here, that's good, because there are a lot of times where you see these recurring issues being tested within certain areas, and it's good to see similar fact patterns or similar essays and know, hey, maybe the first time I whiffed on this, but now I know this, because when I outlined it, I completely missed this issue, and then I wrote down that rule, and now there's no way I'm missing it again. So this sort of brings us to the next section that I want to talk about, just in terms of actually attacking these questions. A lot of times students wonder how much time they should be spending on stuff. How have you been doing with, I know we talked before this in terms of your timing. You said you've done a number of essays already, but how have you been feeling in terms of timing your essays and remaining within that time that allotted 30 to 35 minutes?
I would say sometimes, like I did one today and I got kind of bogged down on one question. Like I did too many details, or like you said, like probably too long of spending time on rule statements. So, I mean, for the most part, I feel like I'm fine. Or sometimes I have a tendency, I think, when I'm doing practices to, just like say like, oh, when the real thing comes, like I'll take the timing more seriously. So I would say like I'm pretty comfortable, but like sometimes I start to feel the heat. And then also like I think initially I didn't know you were supposed to be doing around 30 minutes per essay. So like I was kind of just like sitting there like I thought, because it says an hour on Barbie, and I thought they meant that I should do the essay in an hour. But I feel like
but they give you like a half hour to grade it, right? To go back through it.
So a half hour is it's not like comfortable always, but it's pretty good, I think.
Okay. So I usually now just go over in terms of what I think you should be spending in terms of marking up different areas of the test. So first off, in terms of just reading through the fact pattern and marking it up, I typically say between 3 and 8 minutes. Don't get too crazy there thinking about my time limit, but when you hit a certain minute threshold and you start to get closer to 10 and you're still just underlining facts and sort of outlining in your head what's happening there, I think you start to find that you're going to get bogged down. You can read through it. I usually say people should read through it once or twice just to really make sure you're hitting, or twice usually, just to really make sure you're hitting everything. Next, I like to say, this is sort of a vague statement, and I recognize that, but it really is so important, right? It's the idea of taking a minute to just really read the call of the question. What is being asked about here? What is the point? What are the issues here? And that you're going to see some of that when you're actually reading through and marking up the question. But take just a minute, 30 seconds, and really say, okay, this is really the point here. This is a con law essay with a family law twist at the end. This is what's really the point. Then I usually say take 2 to 3 minutes to just outline. And when I say outline, I don't mean to say, okay, this has to go here, this has to go here. It's more like Aaron's contract with Brad, so you'll have a semicolon or Roman numeral 1. Aaron's contract with Brad is revocable because blank. And then underneath that, you'll really dig into the question, right? You'll really start and say what your issue statement is. But just by calling out in big letters with those headings, saying this is the first issue, this is the second issue, and this is the third issue. And those will allow you to sort of give you benchmarks to put your information into. Because once you sort of start putting all of this together, it's just going to be a matter of finding the issues, setting up those headings, plugging the facts and the rules underneath those headings. And it sounds second nature to a lot of people, right? It doesn't sound like we're reinventing the wheel here, but a lot of times I think what gets people with the bar exam essays is that in law school, so much of what we do is about getting to maybe, right? The idea of getting the maybe and getting there. That's not what we're doing here. And what we're doing here is we're looking at the facts. We're saying, okay, we're not getting to maybe, we're getting to black or white. We're getting the yes or no and because. And when you start to say, well, if this, that, the other thing, if this, that, the other thing, that's when we're going to start to run into timing problems. That's where we're going to start to learn points. So be hard with your language. We don't want mushy language in our answers here. And once we get past that 2 to 3 minute period of organizing, that's when the rubber hits the road. That's when you got to write like your life depended on it. You got to crank out your fingers, and that's when we're getting those rule statements. That's when we're connecting those facts that we underlined with the rules they imputed, and that's when we're going to really start following closely that IRAC form, maximizing our points there. And that next part, that's usually going to be between 18 to 20 minutes, and that part is where we're going to really get our points. That's when we're going to turn into people who are getting high scores on this essay, on this essay section. And like I said before, just don't get bogged down, because a lot of times, and I can tell you this happened to me when I took the UBE myself, I found myself at the 32, 33 minute mark, and I was like, I see the points there. I see there's more, and I'm so insecure about leaving points on the board. But I knew that if I didn't move on, right, if I didn't get to that last question, I would always sort of, I was leaving points on the board with the question I hadn't seen yet, right? Because let's say that the one that I was struggling through, I could only get so many points, or I was close enough that other people were struggling and they were also going to make a curve where I'd still get a lot of points there. But by not attacking or giving myself an opportunity to really maximize the points on my last question, I was cutting off my nose to spite my face. So I ended up moving on, and the last question ended up being one of my stronger subjects. It all worked out, but I do think, especially in the heat of the moment, it's important that you don't really get bogged down there. So, do you have any questions on this second part that we're sort of running through here?
I assume you recommend around 30 minutes per question. I mean, per essay. But do you ever think it's worth it to do like 35-25 or some sort of breakdown like that?
Absolutely. So, I usually say that 30 minutes is what I recommend, right? And the reason I recommend that is primarily because when I say it's okay to go 35-25, a lot of times people are like, okay, that's great. So, and then they're at the 40-minute mark and they are not giving themselves a shot on another question. So I think really that if you feel that this is a question that deserves 35 minutes, that you want to nail, you want to get a 6, then I think you can take that time. But I do not think you should be spending 40 minutes on a question. I don't think you should really be getting past 35 minutes unless you are like, I am getting every single point out of this. And even then, you're really putting yourself in a tougher position on the later questions. So my advice is that while I do think it is acceptable under some circumstances, when you're doing a lot of these back to back to back, that can sort of become, when you're doing it over 3 hours, it can become a big problem. Because all of a sudden, we're looking at a situation where I took too much time here, I took too much time there, and I'm shortchanging questions that I otherwise may have been maximizing points on. So as you get closer to the back of your exam, closer to the end, the second half where you have three essays remaining, I think it's a little more you can play with your time as long as you're running well on time. But let's say you took that extra 5 minutes on the first 3 essays, right? Now, all of a sudden, let's say there's a 35-minute essay in the back. You're taking 15 for one essay and then 20 for another. You're just putting yourself in a tough spot if you do that consistently across the board. So that's the reason that I typically try to say, hey, keep within that 30-minute window. Okay, so those are sort of my big initial thoughts on the essays, the MEE essays. Obviously, we'll dig a little deeper into this once we do an essay. We're going to come back and I'll have you do one, and we'll sort of look at the facts there and break down more specifically how and where you can maximize the points there. But now I just wanted to talk briefly to you about the MPTs, because you asked a little bit about the MPTs, and you said something to me that I hear a lot, and it's this idea that the MPTs are shortchanged by a lot of the bar prep companies. I don't think Barcast ourselves, we don't actually post any audio lectures about the MPT, and the reason for that, at least on our end, is that there's just there's no memorization for the NPT. So in order to really learn the NPT, the only way to do it is to sort of do it to work through those fact patterns, to work through those practice exams. So how many timed NPTs have you done to this point?
I think we only had one workshop with it, but I don't think we did. Like, I have one scheduled that I might do tomorrow, or the next day. But I have not. I don't think I've done a full one timed yet.
So I know that a lot of times in these Barbary NPT workshops, I don't actually remember my own, but I know that when I was in law school, my final year, we did a whole workshop on NPTs, and we talked about how to best maximize our time there. So we have 90 minutes, let's say, for an essay, one of these NPTs, right? And with those as well, it's really important we stick within that 90-minute period, because we start to shortchange us on the back end of the second essay as well. And the NPTs really, what I tell everyone is they are so doable. They are so surmountable that I wouldn't stress them the same way I would committing a lot of this stuff to memory, and the same way I would making sure that you don't get down on yourself as you're working through these MEE essays. And yes, so it'll be 2 90-minute sections. And the biggest tip I can give you ahead of one of these sessions, these practice NPTs, is that you should really be spending half your time outlining and half your time actually doing the essay. And now, I will tell you, I am not somebody who does that. I'm not somebody who spends half their time outlining anything, really. But for the NPT, it's sort of integral. There's really no better way to do it. But the way that you do it is important, because that's 45 minutes of time you're costing yourself writing, theoretically, right? So the way that I always did it, and the way I always tell my students to do it, is that as you're writing and as you do a few of these NPTs, you'll start to get a feel for, when you're reading through the facts, what laws are being imputed. You'll see the rule statements within the cases that you're seeing. So what I always tell students to do is sort of, as you're reading through these, quickly see those rules that are being put forth in the cases, jot down those rules. Just write out the full rule statements as you see them, verbatim from the thing. Type them out really quickly. Don't waste too much time on them. And as you're going through these the cases, I always say read the cases first, because you'll see what the rules that are being tested here. And the library cases will give you a feel for what your facts are really about. So you'll see when you go through these cases, okay, this is a 3-part rule, this is the exception to that 3-part rule, and this is where this rule does not apply. So then when you go back to the actual facts during this period, you'll say, okay, this is how this fact falls within this rule that was covered in this case in the library. This fact obviously means that this rule does not apply, and that's how it falls under this rule. So then you're going to set up these headings to say this applies, or the rule for John whatever applies here. And then the second heading is going to say, by contrast, blah, 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 the rule, blah, 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 applies here. And then you're going to sort of break it down as your bar exam course likely instructed, in terms of this case is readily distinguishable from this case is mirrors the facts of this case within the library, and set up those sentences as well too, right? So when I'm saying outline, I want you to literally set up a plug-and-play situation to say, the facts of this case mirror those of blank. And that's going to be your case that was in the library somehow, that you're going to see a clear and direct line comparison to, right? By contrast, when you see a case that is very different from, regardless whether you see it, I want you to write, say, the facts of this case are readily distinguishable from blank. And that's going to be another set of sentences that really just sets you up. You can just plug and play with whatever the case is, whatever the case isn't. And you should have that typically under each of your headings, whatever the major rules may be that are being tested there. Sometimes you won't always have that, but for the most part, you're going to have that in every NPT. The readily distinguishable case, the readily comparable case. And by setting up those simple sentences and the rules, by the time you hit that 45-minute mark and you say, okay, I'm ready to write, it's you're already like halfway there, because you already have everything you need in terms of organization. Everything is clearly earmarked. So whenever they're going to go through your exam, when they're already going to see, okay, this guy knows what's being tested here. He knows which cases are comparable. He knows which are distinguishable. And as long as you are correctly applying the rules there to the facts you've been provided in the subsequent section underneath, following those sentences, you're really going to be in a great spot, because it's so much, the MPT, about organization, and it's about showing the people who are reading your exams that you know what you're talking about. You know how to synthesize relevant facts and compare and contrast the law in different cases, in different situations. So do you have any questions just in terms of what I sort of went on my rant about the MPT?
More calm about having not done one yet, honestly. So
yeah, I think you'll see reading through some model answers for the MPT, I think, is helpful as well, just because it will give you a feel for what these should look like, and you'll see a little bit of what I mean in those answers, where you'll see the comparison and the contrast statements. So set those up for yourself every time, so you can safely rely on them and plug and play. And the rule statements are a little tough, because a lot of times you'll get a legal statute right in the MPT packet, and that may be the rule statement. Sometimes it'll be multiple rule statements, so you don't have to dive into those usually. I don't recommend copying all of that verbatim. I recommend instead looking at those cases in the library and saying, okay, what are the rule statements in this case? What are the rule statements in this case? And for the most part, you'll see a lot of crossover there. There'll usually be a similar rule that applies across the cases, and then an additional element that is sprinkled in throughout the other parts. One thing that I want to mention about the MEE that I did not mention before is this idea that in order to really excel at the MEE section of the bar exam, you have to get comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable. And that's not something that comes naturally to law students. But if you don't get comfortable with this idea of just saying, hey, if I blank on this and I just go, I take the facts in front of me and I apply them to, let's say I know 3 of the 4 elements of this rule, and I apply the relevant facts, there are still points to be had there, and I should be okay. I can ride the curve through that. I think it's so important that students don't panic when that happens, right? Because it's so easy to look at those situations and to completely implode. And with the bar exam essays, you have to remember that there are going to be so many other students who are blanking if you're blanking as well. Don't beat up on yourself. Definitely don't be talking about practice essays in terms of your fellow students after the bar exam or after any group practice sessions, because a lot of times you'll be like, oh my god, I can't believe I missed that one issue, and they may be wrong about that issue. Obviously, that's something people do in law school a lot, but on the bar exam especially, it's important that you don't get too down on yourself in this early process. You have to sort of have this confidence in the fact that as long as you're doing the work, as long as you're committing these rules to memory, this is all going to come together, and as long as you're building these strong essay tactics, this is all going to come together in a way that really works. So that does it for us. Thanks so much for joining us. Seth will be back. We're going to go over an essay in our next video. Thanks so much, Seth, for joining the show. Remember to subscribe to the channel and follow Barcast Audio on Instagram. You can check out our website, barcastaudio.com, for audio lectures, audio outlines, and essay attack sheets. So, till then, bye now, guys.